Welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another Florida Amazing 10. Today we're going to Manatee County and the city of Bradenton to take a look at a nearly forgotten historical site that was a popular destination for tourists more than 120 years ago. Known as the Braden Castle ruins, it's only 2 miles east of downtown Bradenton. It's an interesting site for quite a few reasons. While it's not large, no place in the state is quite like it. So if you're interested in Florida's history and want to visit a spot that's been popular since at least the 1890s, check it out the next time you're in the neighborhood. Oh yeah, the neighborhood is pretty cool too. The Wayback Machine is now set for the 1830s, so let's see how Bradenton got its start and its name.
Amazing history fact number 1. Bradenton is named after a family that lived in the area for only 11 years. Not much is known about Dr. Joseph Addison Braden and his family. It's thought that he was born in 1811 in Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. Braden's early life hasn't been documented. In fact, we don't even know where or how he got the title of doctor. We pick up his story when he joined up with his brother Hector by moving to Tallahassee in the 1830s, around the same time he married Virginia Ward. It was there the Bradens, along with their slaves, established a cotton plantation. They appear to have suffered money problems brought on by the Panic of 1837, however. Joseph Braden lost everything, but retained enough to fund his family's move to the Manatee River area in what was still Hillsborough County. They brought their slaves, as slaves were often the last assets to sell in financial difficulty. Around 1843, Joseph and Hector were able to secure 1,100 acres or 450 hectares of land to establish a new plantation. They grew tobacco, rice, and oranges, trying to see what would do best in an area to which agriculture was new. Hector would die in 1846, possibly in a hurricane that hit the area. Some said he drowned, and others think he was trapped in quicksand. Amazing history fact number 2. Braden hoped to enjoy the sweet taste of success by growing sugarcane. Industrial sugarcane production is very labor-intensive, and this required that more slaves worked for Braden than anywhere else in the area except for the Gamble plantation north of the Manatee River. Yet another sugar plantation, it encompassed an area 3 times the size and required over 200 slaves just to process the sugarcane. Throughout the newly made state, it was hoped that sugar production would compete with the Spanish colonies in the West Indies. However, due to conflicts with the Seminole communities, along with limited success in cultivating the sugarcane, the crop wouldn't become a major industry until areas around Lake Okeechobee were drained and mechanized cultivation could start in the 1930s. Amazing history fact number 3. Not logs, sod, or adobe. In Florida, we built with tabby. Tabby doesn't sound like a building material, yet it's a type of concrete that uses one of Florida's most plentiful assets. Making tabby originated in Africa, but like so many technologies that came from that continent, its origins have gone unstudied. The name tabby is also African, though it has an Arabic connection. In that language, tabby means mixture of mortar and lime. It was introduced to Florida by the Spanish and was in common use in St. Augustine. The process would spread as the territory developed. The British would also use it. One of the largest examples of tabby construction is the Kingsley Cotton Plantation on Fort George Island near Jacksonville. It was owned by Zephaniah Kingsley, a British slaver, though the plantation had been previously built in 1765. The foundation of the main buildings are tabby, while the slave quarters are entirely constructed of it. Tabby is made by crushing and burning oyster shells to create quicklime. The lime gets mixed with water, sand, and wood ash. More oyster shells are used as an aggregate. The ingredients were mixed in roughly equal proportions, poured into wooden frames called cradles, and built up layer by layer until the desired height was achieved. Walls would be built in courses. The cradles were held together by wooden pins that left holes behind once the tabby was solid. You can see those holes in the castle ruins as well as the slave quarters. Shell middens along the coast and rivers supplied the shells to make tabby. Followers of this channel probably know what middens are by now. They're essentially trash mounds created by indigenous communities and mostly contain mollusk shells. Making tabby is labor-intensive, but it's simple enough to mix and pour and could be prepared by unskilled slaves. Stucco was usually applied to the tabby to create a smooth surface and to keep it from eroding. The stucco was made from lime, sand, and water. You can see the stucco on the slave quarters at Kingsley, but Braden Castle appears to have been different. The ruins show no evidence of stucco. Some think this means the castle was never completed, but that's unlikely. A coating of stucco isn't that much more work. It may seem odd that the rough surface was acceptable to the Bradens, especially on the interior, but they could have finished it with wood paneling or something similar. As I said, tabby took large amounts of labor, but for plantation owners such as Kingsley and Braden, that wasn't a problem. They just made their slaves do it. Which brings us to amazing history fact number 4. Florida's development was driven by thousands of enslaved people. Joseph Braden's family was one of the largest slave owners in the state. It's likely that they owned over 100. The sad truth is that the plantation system was completely dependent on the labor of enslaved people. During the 25 years Kingsley owned his plantation, cotton production was secondary to his principal business of buying, selling, and training slaves. Thousands of newly enslaved people, direct from West Africa, would pass through the gates of the plantation. Kingsley's slaves commanded a premium in the market and were often smuggled into British Georgia. There was great wealth in the South, but it was primarily tied up in the slave economy. In 1860, the economic value of slaves in the U.S. exceeded the combined value of all the nation's railroads, factories, and banks. Amazing history fact number 5. While it's made of tabby, the design was one typically built of wood. Braden Castle was a dog trot plan, a style of house that was common throughout the southeastern U.S. and originated at the tail end of the 18th century. As might be guessed, the main feature of the style is a large breezeway or dog trot. Feel free to make a comment on how it got its name. The dog trot runs through the center to keep it cool. The style often consisted of 2 cabins and a breezeway, all under one roof. There were either 1 or 2 rooms on either side, and one side used for cooking and eating, while the other was used for living and sleeping. The castle followed this plan with 2 rooms on either side of the dog trot. There aren't many examples of dog trots built in a material other than wood, so the castle is unusual for that as well as having 2 floors. There are other 2-floored dog trots, but they're rare. Each of its 8 rooms were 20 feet or 6 meters square, with a hall 10 foot or 3 meters wide. The dimensions are common to dog trots, as are the broad, covered porches I believe it had on the ends of the house. They would have also been 2 floors, and it's likely they had already rotted away by 1890. Its walls were 20 inches or 51 centimeters thick. The height of each floor was an impressive 12 feet or 3.6 meters, and it appears that each course of tabby was about a foot or 30 centimeters tall. Each room had tall windows, possibly with glass and certainly with shutters, as well as a door opening into the dog trot. There was a fireplace in each room and 4 chimneys. Its floors, porches, and roof were built of wood, and the roof was surmounted by a wooden observatory that measures 5 by 10 feet or 1.5 to 2 meters, and it was 6 feet tall with a peaked roof. The castle likely had 2 staircases, and as other dog trot styles, they were probably located inside rooms. Amazing history fact number 6. There's a bunch of castles in Florida, but Braden's might be the only one that deserves the name.
Let's take a quick look at 4 of Florida's other castles. The term castle doesn't have a simple definition, though the basic meaning used by many historians is what I'll use here: a private fortified residence. Walt Disney World's Cinderella Castle is possibly the most recognizable building in the state. It's certainly the most visited and most photographed, as the Magic Kingdom had an attendance of nearly 21 million people in 2019, making it the #1 theme park in the world. The iconic building is known as the weenie of the park. What's a weenie, you ask? Coined by none other than Walt Disney himself, the term originates with a daily interaction Disney had with his dog, Lady. When Disney came home from work, he'd toss Lady a hot dog or weenie, all the while appreciating how much she was drawn to it. He'd go on to use the term when talking with his staff on how to get guests to go in certain directions. Disney Imagineer Marty Sklar stated that a weenie is an architectural concept describing visual magnets that draw guests from one area to another. Clearly, this weenie looks like a castle, but is it? Well, it's not a residence, and it's hardly fortified. Plus, since it's the entrance to Fantasyland, we can assume that as real as it is, it's still a fiction, a fantasy. In Homestead sits the outstanding Coral Castle. The sign at the entrance remarks, "You will be seeing unusual accomplishment." Carved into stone, this was Ed Leedskelin's greeting to visitors. Built of over 1,000 tons of coral rock, all by the hands of the diminutive Ed, it's easily one of the remarkable oddities of Florida. But is it a castle? It certainly was a residence. Ed lived here while building it. And it's somewhat fortified. The walls are 3 feet or a meter wide, though they're barely over 6 feet or 2 meters high, which doesn't afford much protection. Like Coral Castle, Solomon's Castle in rural Hardee County was the work of one person. Howard Solomon took a home and transformed it into the structure you see here. It's clad with aluminum newspaper printing plates, giving it a unique armored appearance. While the castle's exterior is quite a sight, inside there's dozens upon dozens of Solomon's artworks, paintings, sculptures, working mechanisms, and more. Solomon's Castle was a residence, but I doubt anyone would think that covering a building in thin sheets of aluminum would protect it from attack. The oldest masonry fort in the continental U.S. is located in St. Augustine. Known as the Castillo de San Marcos and built by the Spanish, it's a major tourist attraction and a part of the National Parks Service. Composed of massive walls of local coquina stone, designed to withstand a naval bombardment, it was outfitted with a battery of cannon. As such, it's certainly fortified, and while Florida has many other military structures, there are none quite so imposing. Yet regardless of the title Castillo, it's really a fort rather than a castle, as it, in turn, housed military garrisons of Spanish, British, American, and briefly Confederate soldiers.
So what of Braden Castle? As you've seen, it was a residence, and its thick, tabby walls were fairly impenetrable. There's also one incident in its history that's pertinent. On the night of March 31st, 1856, a party of 7 Seminole warriors approached the castle while the Braden family were inside, along with 2 visitors. One of the visitors, a Sarah Gates, would write a letter to her sister, providing the only first-hand account that survives. She wrote, "Dr. Braden and his family were at supper, and the woman upstairs with the baby said somebody was outside and blew out the lights. It was the Indians attacking." Dr. Braden exchanged gunfire with the Seminoles and they fled. Neither they nor the Bradens suffered casualties. Braden was the only shooter inside, and some accounts of the event state that he used a 9-shot repeating rifle he had borrowed from Major Gamble. The Seminoles might have thought that there were several men firing from the castle, and that's why they retreated. The problem is that the first effective repeating rifle wasn't invented until 4 years later. There were earlier rifles that used a revolver mechanism, but they were limited to 6 shots and were awkward to reload. The Seminoles went on to capture several mules and slaves from the Braden plantation, but a week later a detachment of militia tracked them to Big Charlie Creek. After a brief skirmish in which several of the Seminoles were killed, the mules and slaves were reclaimed. Amazing history fact number 7. Built to last decades, the Bradens abandoned it after only 7 years. Not long after the Seminole incident, the Braden family picked up their belongings and left their home. The property was foreclosed upon in 1857, and they moved to LaGrange, Georgia. Sadly, their story ends there, as it's reported that Dr. Braden died of dysentery in 1859. We don't know what happened to his family. In 1867, Mary Pilote, wife of Dr. John Pilote, purchased the Braden plantation and castle for $2,000. They had moved into the area after the Civil War. Mary's parents, James and Faraba Cooper, lived in the castle while Mary and John built a home. James Cooper was a plantation owner in North Florida, and during the Second Seminole War, he was commissioned Major General in the Florida Volunteers. He later served on the Florida Secession Convention, where he voted in favor of leaving the Union prior to the Civil War. The Coopers lived in the house until General Cooper died in 1879. Amazing history fact number 8. The castle was once again abandoned and began its decline. The Coopers would be the last time anyone lived in the house, even though it was only 29 years old. By 1890, the house had already started to deteriorate. Part of the structure on the right-hand side had collapsed, and there's no windows or shutters left. The broad porches are also long gone. In 1903, a brush fire would destroy the wooden portions of the castle and left only a shell of tabby that would continue to erode and be battered by hurricanes. Between 1880 and 1945, there were 15 hurricanes that hit Bradenton. The castle was also a popular place to visit, so vandalism would have caused more deterioration. And that leads us to Amazing History Fact number 9. In the 1920s, Braden Castle entered a new chapter when a different type of tourist arrived. The title, Tin Can Tourist, was applied to the early Americans who took to the roads in cars and trucks, camping in tents, or living in modified homes built on their vehicles. The castle ruins would become a makeshift gathering place. In 1924, the Camping Tourists of America purchased the property, making it an official campground. Later, parts of the property were divided into 200 40-foot lots. The lots were sold, and by 1928, many vacation cottages were built. Later, a mobile home park would be built next to the main property, and eventually the area would be called Braden Castle Park. Amazing History Fact number 10. The castle ruins became a recognized part of American history. In 1983, Braden Castle Park was designated as a National Historic Landmark District. The district is found between the Manatee and Braden Rivers, Ponce de Leon Street, and Pilot Avenue. It contains 192 historic buildings and 3 structures. While many of the cottages that surround the castle have been remodeled, most of them date from the 1930s. The cottages are quaint, interesting, and rather tightly packed, mostly sitting only a few feet from their neighbors. Today, the castle sits in Castle Plaza and is owned by the Braden Castle Association.
By the way, remember that Hector Braden was thought to have died during that hurricane? The people who told of him getting caught in a quicksand would say that later, when he was found, he was still mounted on top of his horse, with both of them drowned, and with his eyes wide open and his hands still on the reins. Thank you once again for watching one of my videos. If you learned something, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.